Amsterdam, July 1945. A sick man sat across a plain wooden table from a row of Allied investigators. The war in Europe was over. On the table between them was a stack of documents, bills of sale, certificates, letters, and every one of them pointed at him. They said he had sold a Dutch national treasure, a painting by Johannes Vermeer, to the Nazi Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. In the Netherlands, that was collaboration with the enemy. It was a capital offense. He could be shot for it. So the man stood up, pointed at the papers, and offered the only defense he had left. It wasn't "I'm innocent." It was a confession to something far worse. "The painting was mine," he said. "I painted it myself." You're listening to The Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, a failed painter who fooled the greatest art experts in the world and then had to convince a court he was a criminal to save his own life. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. His name was Han van Meijeren, a Dutch painter born in 1889. By the 1920s, the critics had made up their minds about him. Technically skilled, they said, competent, and utterly without originality. Derivative. For a man who wanted to be remembered as a master, it was a quiet kind of death. So in the early 1930s, he disappeared. He rented a villa called La Primavera in the south of France, far from the Dutch art world and its loops and its experts. He drew the curtains, and he started buying old paintings, cheap, worthless 17th century canvases, not to study them, but to scrape them clean. What Van Meijeren built in that villa wasn't a painting, it was a machine for defeating experts. He understood that the men who authenticated old masters didn't just look at a picture, they tested it. They checked whether the paint had hardened the way 3 centuries of aging hardens paint. They looked for craquelure, the fine web of cracks that spreads across the surface of a genuinely old canvas. A forger who only copied the image would be caught in an afternoon. So Van Meijeren didn't just copy the image, he copied the age. He ground his own pigments by hand, lapis lazuli, lead white, vermilion, the same materials available to Vermeer himself 300 years earlier. Then he mixed those pigments with one ingredient that hadn't existed in Vermeer's time at all, a synthetic resin related to bay kaolite, the early plastic. After painting, he slid each canvas into an oven and baked it at a little over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, until the resin set into a shell that no chemical test of the era could tell from centuries-old paint. Then, while it was still warm, he rolled the canvas around a wooden cylinder. The surface cracked, exactly the way age cracks it. He rubbed India ink into the cracks, wiped the surface clean, and left the shadows of 300 years sitting in the fissures. He spent years getting it right. This wasn't a prank, it was a campaign. It's worth pausing on what kind of patience that takes. Most forgers want money, and they want it fast. Van Meijeren spent the better part of a decade in a rented house perfecting a chemistry experiment, with no guarantee any of it would ever pay off. He wasn't really chasing money. Not yet. He was chasing the critics who had called him derivative, and quietly building the weapon he'd use to prove them fools. In 1937, he was ready. The painting he chose to unveil was a religious scene he called The Supper at Emmaus, Christ at a table, painted in a style that was almost but not quite the Vermeer the world thought it knew. Now he needed someone to authenticate it, not just anyone. He needed the single most respected Vermeer authority alive. That was Abraham Bray Dias. Bray Dias was 82 years old. He had spent his entire career cataloguing Vermeer's handful of known paintings, barely more than 30 in all the world. When the canvas was brought to his study, the old man examined it with a loupe, his hands reportedly trembling, and then he gave it everything he had. In the November issue of the Burlington magazine, under his own name, Bray Dias declared the painting the masterwork of Johannes Vermeer. It sold to a museum in Rotterdam for 520,000 guilders, around $3 million in today's money. The art world didn't just accept the forgery, It celebrated it as the discovery of the century. But the Supper at Emmaus wasn't the last painting Van Meeken would sell. It was only the first. Over the next 6 years, more lost masterpieces appeared. Vermeer's, works attributed to another Dutch master, Peter de Hooch. One after another, they were authenticated. One after another, they were bought, by private collectors and by respected Dutch institutions. By the time he was done, Van Meeken had earned somewhere around 7.5 million guilders, an astonishing fortune built entirely on paintings he'd made in his own studio. And then the war came. The Netherlands fell under Nazi occupation, and one of Van Meeken's forgeries found its way to the most dangerous customer imaginable. In 1943, a painting called Christ with the Woman Taken in Adultery was sold through an art dealer for 1.6 million guilders. The buyer was Hermann Göring, Hitler's Reichsmarshal and one of the most voracious art looters in history. Göring was so pleased with his Vermeer that he handed over 137 looted Dutch paintings to get it. A fake hanging in the private collection of a Nazi war criminal. When the war ended, someone was going to come looking for it, and the paper trail led to exactly one door. In the spring of 1945, Allied investigators combing through the wreckage of the Nazi art empire found Göring's collection hidden in an Austrian salt mine. Among the recovered works was the Vermeer. They traced its provenance backward through occupied Europe, every sale, every signature, every receipt, and the trail ended at the Amsterdam townhouse of Han van Meijeren. They arrested him. The charge was plundering Dutch cultural property and collaborating with the enemy. He was looking at a firing squad. For 6 weeks he said nothing useful. He drank. His health, already failing, got worse, and then, in July, he broke. Not into a denial, but into a boast. The Vermeer Göring had bought, he told them, was no Vermeer. He'd painted it himself. And so were the others, the Emmaus, the masterpieces in the museums, the discovery of the century. All of them his. The investigators laughed, a washed-up painter claiming he'd fooled the entire art world just to dodge a treason charge. He had to explain it 3 times before anyone bothered to write it down. Sit with the absurdity of where he stood. The one person Van Meeken had truly swindled, in any moral sense, was Hermann Göring, a Nazi, and for defrauding a war criminal, the Dutch state was preparing to execute him. The only way to save his life was to confess that his greatest masterpiece, the thing the critics had finally been forced to call genius, was a lie he'd baked in an oven. The court didn't take his word for it. The judge, in effect, told him to prove it. So under guard, in a studio set up inside an Amsterdam prison called the Veteringsskans, Van Meeken did the one thing that could save him. He painted a new one. Over several weeks, with officials and reporters watching, he produced another Vermeer, young Christ teaching in the temple, using the same ground pigments, the same resin, the same oven and cylinder and ink. It worked. The man who had fooled the experts now had to forge in public to be believed. In October 1947, he was convicted, not of treason, but of forgery and fraud. The sentence was 1 year, and the Dutch public, who might have despised a collaborator, instead embraced him as a folk hero. The little man who'd taken Göring for a fortune and made fools of the snobs who'd dismissed him. He never served the year. In December of that same year, his heart gave out. He was 58. There's a question historians still argue about. How did so many trained experts get fooled for so long? One view, argued by the writer Jonathan Lopez, is uncomfortable. It says the art world had every incentive not to look too closely. Experts who had staked their reputations, and in some cases their money, on these paintings being real had little reason to question them. To doubt one forgery was, quietly, to doubt them all. Against that, Bray Dias's own private letters suggest something simpler and sadder, that he genuinely, completely believed. According to those who've studied them, there's no sign he was protecting anything but his own conviction. Both readings fit the evidence. They can't both be the whole truth. But here's the detail that turns this from a story about chemistry into something stranger. Van Meijeren didn't just imitate Vermeer's brushwork. For years, he had studied the published theories of Abraham Bray Dias himself. And Bredius had a pet theory, one he'd argued in print for decades. He believed that somewhere out there, undiscovered, Vermeer must have painted religious scenes in an Italian style early in his life. No such paintings existed in the catalogue. They were a gap, a wish. So Van Meekeren painted exactly those. He didn't forge a Vermeer. He forged the discovery that the most famous Vermeer expert in the world had been waiting his entire life to make. That's why the old man's hands trembled over the canvas. He wasn't authenticating a painting. He was finally finding the thing he'd always believed was out there. Van Meekeren hadn't fooled Bredius's eyes. He'd used Bredius's own dream against him. The Van Meekeren case usually gets told as a caper, the forger who outwitted the experts and humiliated a Nazi. But underneath it is something less comfortable. The authentication that fooled the world wasn't really about paint or pigment or cracks in a canvas. It was about authority, about how much we trust the person who tells us a thing is real. An 82-year-old expert saw what he most wanted to see, signed his name to it, and an entire industry fell in line behind him. The institutions that failed then still largely work the same way now. And most of Van Meekeren's forgeries hang in collections to this day, relabeled. Not as Vermeers, as the work of the man who, for a few strange years, was better at being Vermeer than anyone alive. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep, but maybe don't tell them it's all real until after they've finished. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.